I think Monsanto's biggest product, and also I think where most of their renown starts to come from, they develop Roundup first, right? I mean, this is the thing that I think people don't fully appreciate sometimes, that it didn't start with like the idea of like, what if we had a product that was that would survive an herbicide? They started with the herbicide.
Yes.
I mean, will you talk about that development, and then how they decided, like, well, wait a second, what if we found something that our herbicide wouldn't work on? Then we could corner a whole nother market.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all connected. And Emma's point is so important because so much changes in agriculture by the 50s and 60s with farmers, mechanizing their operations, and with this kind of flight from the rural countryside, which makes these chemicals that much more important and easier for Monsanto to sell. This is the way you can farm. You don't have to have all these laborers. You can have chemicals to do your work for you. And it's actually 2,4,5-T that they're trying to get away from when they create Roundup. Roundup is created at around 1970. And it's right after the Vietnam War. They're searching for something that's going to be non-toxic. And that's how it's pitched originally. Roundup is going to be this safe and environmentally friendly herbicide. And it's super weird, actually, because you'd mentioned detergents. And the reason that glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, which has phosphorus as its base, is the chemical, is because they're getting out of the all detergent business. So all, like ALL, lowercase a, detergent is a Monsanto creation, back to like all the things that they created. And in the 60s, we have this eutrophication problem, algae blooms up in the Great Lakes, and detergents are partially blamed for that, phosphate-based detergents. So Monsanto is sitting there that has all this phosphate that it's mining out of Idaho, all of this capital infrastructure in phosphate, and now they got to get rid of all that phosphate in their detergents. And that's how they create Roundup. They're trying to figure out what to do with all this phosphate they have. And bam, they're doing these experiments and they find glyphosate in 1970. It's ultimately approved by the EPA in 1974. And you're right, for decades it becomes this blockbuster herbicide. It becomes the first billion-dollar herbicide in history. Broad spectrum, kills weeds super effectively. Farmers love it. But boy, wouldn't it be great if you could engineer your crops to be resistant to it so you could spray it even more.
What was going on with the EPA at the time that they were rubber stamping this kind of stuff? I mean, was there just a generalized connection with industry or an eagerness to perceive these as technological advancements? Or was it just, we don't know, or they were not aware of how this was going to affect people down the line?
It's a great question. And, think about the timing of this. It's kind of perfect timing for Monsanto. This is right when the EPA is being created. Yeah. And it's really nascent. It doesn't have the reputation yet. It also doesn't have necessarily the resources as the Nixon administration. And what you see, and I think this is a story that echoes throughout the book, is the ways in which the companies that are being regulated become the regulators in a way. They're producing the science, the studies that ultimately are used to decide, well, is this stuff safe or not? And often being, a lot of the company science and company reports are what these agencies lean on. They don't have necessarily the capacity to go out and do all these toxicological studies. And that was like the most surprising, or maybe not the most surprising, but at least most problematic story throughout all this, is just that cozy relationship between Monsanto and the EPA, which of course we can talk about later when it gets to, Roundup's reevaluation in recent years, and these emails that came out in court cases where you'd think these folks were best friends, and this revolving door too between the people working inside the OPP, the pesticide program within the EPA, and companies like Monsanto. So I think it was a product, Emma, of both. Like, it's the timing. It's not really up and running yet, right? It's just starting in some ways. And it's so reliant in so many ways on company-funded science at that point to approve some of these things.
I mean, we still see that in the context of the FDA and the EPA, for that matter. And really, what the EPA or the FDA does is really more evaluate the self-reporting of these things. Is it done differently in Europe? I mean, is it done differently in Europe in the way that they do that with that dynamic? Because, as we move forward, at one point, I think it was in 2005, Europe, was it 2005? Europe said, we're not doing these genetically modified products anymore. We're not into that. Whereas in 2005, in this country, Matt and I were saying beforehand that golden rice was going to solve the world, the hunger problem, which, the idea of it is okay, but talk to how Europe does it differently. And then let's move into, once they have saturated to the extent that they can, the herbicide market, they come up with a sort of, I guess, the killer app, which is the genetically modified corn, essentially.
Yeah, and soybeans, cotton, and a whole host of other things. Totally. Just to answer that, I mean, I think we actually see some countries initiating a kind of moratorium on GMOs in Europe as early as 1999 in certain pockets, and then of course it becomes more formalized in the early 2000s, as you note. And there's more of a precautionary principle in terms of regulation, as opposed to let's put this out. In the case of the United States, when GMOs are being first introduced in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, think about that political moment. This is the time of obviously Reaganomics, and then of course George H.W. Bush, who appoints Dan Quayle, his vice president, to be head of this competitiveness council, of which the number one thing they're looking at is biotechnology and how can we fast track this new technology into the market. And in that moment, the US basically takes this stance that genetically engineered crops or foods produced from genetic engineering will be regulated and treated the same as crops that are bred via conventionally bred and conventionally conducted crop cultivation. And the line in the Federal Register is substantial equivalence, that there's enough of a kind of similarity between the way genetic engineering works and conventional breeding works that we're not going to have special regulations for these products. And that is what leads to the European backlash. You could argue that because we had such a kind of, hey, it's open, do what you get this to market as fast as you can, there was this perception in Europe that this wasn't really vetted as it should be. And can we trust it? And I think the swiftness with which it was introduced was one of the problems for Monsanto. And they even admitted that internally by the 2000s and 2010s, when they're facing all this backlash, they would say things like, well, we were being a little bit arrogant. Well, in some ways, I think we see that pretty clearly in the record, trying to push for this. But yeah, the first Roundup ready crops, the first crops that are genetically engineered to tolerate heavy spraying of Monsanto's signature herbicide Roundup. And you nailed it. That's the goal from the company's perspective. Is we're a chemical company. We have this billion-dollar brand. This is what we want to make crops do. That we want to allow them to tolerate spraying of our very profitable herbicide. They were successful in 1996. That's where we're at the 25th anniversary, in other words, of the introduction of the first kind of large-scale commodity crops that are genetically engineered. And I'll say one other thing about that. The way that they found the Roundup ready trait to make crops tolerate spraying of Roundup, they found that actually at their waste dumps outside of their Roundup manufacturing plants. They found there was so much pollution, as it were, effluent, that they found these microorganisms, actually an agrobacterium, that had this ability to tolerate glyphosate. And so they were able to take that gene from their own waste piles and insert that into.
So in other words, they'd look out on their waste piles and say, wait, there's something alive in there. Let's take that and commodify it, essentially.